This is Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi. Here now, Tony Bruschi.
At what point do we stop calling it illness and start calling it who someone is? That's a question nobody wants to ask out loud. It's uncomfortable. It sounds cruel. It cuts against everything we've been taught about compassion and second chances and third and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh and eighth and ninth and 10th and 12th and 11th and 13th and 14th and 15th and 16th and 17th chances. 18th, 19th, 20th chances. 20th, 21st, 22nd chances. But we're going to ask it anyway because Nick Reiner kind of forced us to. Now, addiction is real. Mental illness is real. I'm not here to debate that. I'm not interested in pretending these aren't devastating conditions that destroy lives and families every single day in this country. But so is choice. So is pattern. So is a 2-decade track record of destruction, manipulation, and violence that everyone saw coming, except apparently the two people who ended up dead in their own home. This isn't about demonizing addiction. If you've ever loved an addict, you know how reductive that would be. It's about something much harder. It's about recognizing when someone has shown you exactly who they are over and over and over again across years, across interventions, across every possible lifeline, and asking what we're supposed to do with that information when it finally explodes in the worst possible outcome. And if this speaks to you and you want to share your story in the comment section on YouTube, we welcome that. Lots of folks are finding a lot of community here right now on this topic, and we certainly welcome that. And if you would like to participate in that, the comment section on YouTube on our channel is a great place for it. If you're not already there, if you're listening to us on the podcast platforms, Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi is what you can search on YouTube and find us. Press subscribe while you're there, and please weigh in with your thoughts. And if you're on the podcast platforms right now, Apple Podcasts, whatever it may be, please do hit subscribe. And if you don't mind, if you're finding our reporting valuable and these conversations valuable, a review on Apple Podcast would mean the world to us. It signals to others out there that you find this content valuable. And if you do, again, please leave us a quick review. Other folks will find us then and also get the same value out of it that you are finding as well. So thank you in advance for that review on Apple Podcasts. Let's continue. Rob Reiner was 78 years old, one of the most celebrated filmmakers in American history. The Princess Bride, Stand By Me, When Harry Met Sally, A Few Good Men. The man shaped how multiple generations understand storytelling. His wife, Michele, was 68, a photographer and producer, and by every account, a woman who poured herself into her family and her community. They were married for 36 years. They had 3 children together, and on Sunday afternoon in December, just the other week, their daughter walked into their Brentwood home and found them both stabbed to death. Their son, Nick, the youngest, was arrested hours later near USC. He's now facing 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The death penalty is on the table. And the conversation that's already started, the one about mental illness and addiction and whether Nick Reiner is a monster or a victim, is one we need to have carefully because the easy takes in both directions are wrong. They are. So let's start with what we actually know about Nick Reiner. Not speculation, not armchair psychology. What he himself has said on the record over years of interviews and podcast appearances. Okay? We're going to go into all of this. Nick entered his first rehab facility around his 15th birthday. And by the time he was 22, he'd been through 17 treatment programs. 17. Exposed to every modality, every therapeutic approach, every clinical intervention the addiction treatment industry has to offer, and exposed to it with resources that 99% of addicts in this country will never have access to. His family had money. They had connections. They had the ability to place him in facilities that cost more per month than most Americans earn in a year. And here's what Nick did with all of it. In 2018, he appeared on a podcast called Dopey, a show about the journey between addiction and recovery. And he was remarkably candid. He admitted openly to gaming the system, learning what counselors wanted to hear, staying sober just long enough to convince everyone he was better, just long enough to earn his way out, and then going right back to using the second he was free. That's not illness operating on autopilot. That's not a man helplessly caught in the grip of something he can't control. That's called calculation. That is manipulation. That's someone who understood the rules well enough to exploit them. He talked about an incident where he'd been staying in his parents' guest house, sequestered there, and he said after some prior conflict, he went on a multi-day bender, cocaine, uppers, days without sleep, and when the paranoia and rage hit critical mass, he started destroying things. The TV first, then the lamps, then everything else he could get his hands on until the entire guest house was wrecked. His parents took him back anyway. He talked about stealing OxyContin from a sick elderly woman who actually needed it for her pain. And when the interviewer pressed him on it, he didn't flinch. You throw your morals out the window, he said. That's not a symptom of addiction. That's not something the drugs made him do. That's a man describing, in his own words, a conscious decision to abandon his humanity because the high mattered more than the harm. And this is where people who've actually lived with addicts, who've loved them, enabled them, fought for them, and finally had to walk away from them, recognize something that the clinical language of disease often obscures. Addiction involves choices. Thousands of them every single day. The choice to pick up, the choice to lie, the choice to manipulate, the choice to steal, the choice to keep choosing the substance over every person who loves you over and over until there is nothing left. That doesn't mean addicts are evil. It doesn't mean they deserve to suffer, but it does mean that framing them as passive victims of a hijacked brain with no agency, no responsibility, no culpability for the wreckage they leave behind is a freaking lie. A comforting lie, maybe, but a lie. Nick Reiner wasn't some desperate kid on the street with no options. He was a man with every options, and he chose repeatedly to burn them all down. The family tried everything. They did what families do. They kept hoping. They made a movie about it. Being Charlie came out in 2016. Rob directed. Nick co-wrote the screenplay with a friend he'd met in rehab. The film tells the story of a young man, a privileged Hollywood family, cycling through treatment programs, relapsing, struggling with a father who doesn't know how to reach him. It's thinly veiled as an autobiography. Everyone knew it. That was the point. In interviews promoting the film, Rob Reiner called it the most personal thing I've ever done. He talked about the fights they'd had, the fear, the moments where he had to act like a disciplinarian even though it wasn't his nature because the experts told him tough love was the only way. He said something that in retrospect is almost unbearable to read. Quote, "I'd rather you hate me than be dead in the street." 9 years later, he's dead, allegedly at the hands of the son he was trying to save. Nick, for his part, said the movie was part of his recovery. Said he'd been clean since 19. Said he'd focused on building a life in the industry, working on other projects. A family friend who saw him just 10 days before the murders described him as healthy, put together, looking like a GQ model, on the upswing. Finally turning a corner, as addicts always seem like they're doing on those sporadic upswings. And then Christmas happened. The Christmas party happened. There was a party at Conan O'Brien's house. The Reiners attended, so did Nick, and at some point during the evening, Nick and his father got into an argument. Witnesses described Nick as acting strangely. The specifics are still a little murky. We don't know exactly what was said. We don't know who started it or how it ended. What we do know is that Nick left, and he had all night, hours and hours, to cool down, to call a sponsor, to check himself into a facility, to drive somewhere and sleep it off, to do literally anything other than what prosecutors say happened next. Because first-degree murder in California requires premeditation. It requires that window of time where someone forms the intent to kill, then acts on it. And the gap between the argument at a Christmas party and a double stabbing the very next morning is a whole lot of time to make a different choice. Sometime between Saturday and Sunday afternoon, Rob and Michele Reiner were stabbed to death inside their Brentwood home. The coroner hasn't released an exact time of death yet, which matters because whether this happened at 2 a.m. in a rage or at 10 a.m. after a night of stewing changes the narrative significantly. Their daughter Romy found them, and I want to stop on that for a second because it's easy to let details like this slide past the rush of information. Their daughter walked into her parents' home on Sunday and discovered their bodies. That image will live with her forever. That trauma is permanent, and it exists because of choices her brother allegedly made. Nick wasn't there when she arrived. He was already gone. Police arrested him hours later near the USC campus. Reports indicate he checked into a Santa Monica hotel that same night. Think about that. I mean, really think about that. If Nick Reiner killed his parents in some kind of blackout, some dissociative break, some psychotic episode where he genuinely didn't know what he was doing, would his next move be to calmly leave the scene, travel across the city, and check into a hotel? It's not the behavior of a man lost in the fog of mental illness. That's the behavior of someone who understood exactly what had happened and was trying to figure out his next move. He didn't call 911. He didn't turn himself in. He didn't collapse on the front lawn in horror. He left. He moved. He got a room. Prosecutors are going to call that consciousness of guilt. The defense will have to explain it away somehow, and I honestly don't know how they do it without making Nick look even worse. So here's where we stand legally. Nick Reiner has been charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Special circumstances have been added, specifically the special circumstance of multiple murders. There's also a deadly weapon enhancement for the knife. In California, special circumstances make a case death penalty eligible. DA Nathan Hochman hasn't announced whether his office will pursue it. He said he'll take the family's wishes into consideration, which puts the surviving Reiners in the impossible position of deciding whether they want the state to execute their brother. The son of the victims, the person who allegedly murdered their parents. The prosecution's case will center on premeditation, the argument the night before, the timeline, the fact that Nick had hours to de-escalate and didn't, and everything he did after the killings, the leaving, the hotel, the failure to call for help and turn himself in. They don't need to prove he was sober. They don't need to prove he was thinking clearly. They need to prove he formed the intent to kill and then acted on it. And a man who flees a crime scene and books a hotel room is a man who understood exactly what he'd done. The defense has already tipped its hand. Alan Jackson, Nick's attorney, told reporters there are complex and serious issues in this case and urged the public not to rush to judgment. That's lawyers speak. It means mental illness, addiction, diminished capacity, possibly an argument that Nick wasn't capable of forming premeditation required for first-degree murder because his brain had been so damaged by decades of substance abuse. And here's the uncomfortable truth. That argument might actually work. Diminished capacity is a real legal doctrine. If the defense can show that Nick was in some kind of drug-induced psychosis or that his cognitive function was so impaired he couldn't deliberate or premeditate in a way the law requires, they may be able to knock this down from first-degree to second-degree murder, maybe even voluntary manslaughter. That's a stretch, but not an impossibility. The difference matters. First-degree murder with special circumstances means death row or life without parole. Second degree means 15 to life, which in California means he could theoretically be eligible for parole someday. Voluntary manslaughter is 3 to 11 years. A man who allegedly stabbed both his parents to death could, under certain legal outcomes, walk out of prison before he's 50. So let's ask the question that the legal system isn't designed to answer. What do we do with people who are broken beyond repair? I'm not being rhetorical. I'm not being cruel for the sake of it. I'm asking because this case forces us to confront something our society has no good framework for. And we keep putting people through the system over and over and going, well, I don't know, this is really, they serve no purpose anymore, but what do you do with them? If Nick Reiner's brain is genuinely so destroyed by addiction that he couldn't control himself, if decades of meth and heroin have eroded his capacity for impulse control, for empathy, for rational decision-making, then what? Does that make him less culpable? Or does it make him more dangerous? Because here's what we know. This man was given every resource, every intervention, every soft landing. His family had wealth, access to connections. They tried through love and gentle love and everything in between. They made a movie about their pain, just trying to reach him. They never gave up, and none of it mattered. 17 rehab programs, exposed to the best treatment money can buy, exposed to parents who loved him relentlessly, and he allegedly ended up stabbing them to death in their own home. If that's mental illness, if that's addiction, then what's the treatment? What's the intervention that would have prevented this? Because whatever it is, it didn't exist for Nick Reiner, and if it doesn't exist, then we have to ask a harder question. Some people are not fixable. Some patterns are not breakable. Some damage is permanent, and when someone has demonstrated across 2 decades that no amount of help or love or money or treatment can stop them from hurting the people closest to them, at what point do we stop calling it illness and just start calling it incompatibility with society? Not because we're angry, not because we want revenge, but because public safety has to mean something. Because the next victim shouldn't have to die waiting on us to figure out if the person who kills them is sick or evil, or a combination of both. The death penalty in California is effectively symbolic. The state hasn't executed anyone since '06. Governor Newsom put a moratorium on it. Even if Nick gets sentenced to death, he'd almost certainly die of old age on death row before the state ever acted. So what is that? Justice? Closure? Or just theater dressed up as accountability? Life without parole means he never gets out. Society is protected. The Reiners get whatever closure the system can offer, which isn't much, but it's something. It's the certainty that he can never do this again. Anything less than that means we're gambling. We're hoping someday, somehow, the man who allegedly murdered his parents will become safe enough to release. And that's not a gamble I think anyone's willing to take. It's not a gamble anyone who's watched this pattern unfold would take. It's not what a healthy brain who's actually dealing with reality on reality's terms would say, good idea about. Addiction is a disease. I believe that. I know that. You should too. But disease doesn't make choices. And Nick Reiner made thousands of them, to lie, to manipulate, to steal, to destroy, to take and take and take from people who loved him most and allegedly finally kill. So where does accountability end and illness begin? When someone has proven, documented, exposed, proven again that they cannot be trusted to exist safely among other human beings, what do we owe them? What do we owe society? What do we owe Rob and Michele Reiner, who spent the last 2 decades of their lives trying to save his son, who allegedly thanked them with a knife? I don't have a clean answer. I'm not sure one truly exists, but I know the question matters, and I know a jury is going to have to sit with it, probably for weeks, maybe longer, trying to decide whether Nick Reiner is a victim of his own broken brain or a man who made the worst choice a human being can make. Death row, life without parole, or something else. Where do you think this should land? Tell me in the comments section on YouTube. If you're not already there, Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi is where you will find us. You can make that same search wherever you get podcasts if you want to take us along with you, and then you can follow us. We also have another channel out on the podcast platforms, The Reiner Murders. It covers this case specifically. So if you're wanting to follow just this case alone, you can find that wherever you get podcasts, The Reiner Murders, and press subscribe on it. Our main channel, Hidden Killers with Tony Bruschi, we're carrying all of the same commentary there, and then some of the other cases as well. Wherever it may be, please press subscribe. And if you find this valuable, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That helps other folks know that this exists and that you find it valuable, and it signals to them, hey, this is some valuable content over here. So the review on Apple Podcast is very much appreciated, not only by myself, but the others who then find the material in turn. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Until next time, I'm Tony Bruschi. We'll talk again real soon.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Bruschi and the Hidden Killers podcast.